Morning, YouTubers. Got the fire going for a little ambiance in here. Today's video, if you've been watching my other stick welding videos, you kind of knew, well, obviously we're going to be doing another stick welding video. So today we're going to tackle vertical up. We're going to be doing it with 6013 rods because I know that a lot of you guys, well, pretty much anyone with a stick welder can burn 6013. So that's why we're sticking with that. Now, from a personal perspective, I do not like running 6013 uphill. I find that it just doesn't deposit enough metal and you have to cram the rod into the puddle. And if you don't do that, what ends up happening is your arc gap gets too long and you essentially just start undercutting your metal and too much heat and the molten metal just drips off. Across the board, it's pretty difficult to run uphill, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. So that's what we're going to be working on. Let's get into it. So you probably remember this from my other videos if you've been following along. So what I have here is our test plate where we went from just being able to start the rod to running beads on plate to overlapping beads to horizontal beads, and now we're going to be focusing on vertical up. Vertical up tends to be the hardest of all stick welding, and it's hard for a number of reasons. The biggest one being that if you don't control your arc gap, you're going to have serious issues with the molten puddle just dripping down, okay? So arc gap is huge, your travel speed is huge. The more consistent and better beads you can run in the flat position and horizontal, the better you're going to be at vertical up. It's still going to be hard, but the better you will be. So let's talk about what the actual technique is. Now with 6013, the rod does not deposit much metal, so you really have got to adhere to the proper arc gap. It's really anything but the perfect arc gap will result in problems in your welds. There's just no way around it. I find 7018 is actually far easier to weld uphill than 6013 is. But we're dealing with 6013 today because I know all you guys out there can run it regardless of what welder you have. In the future, when I actually do 7018 welding, I'll teach you how to do vertical up with that. But today we're focusing on the 6013. So the first thing you want to do is take a rod, put it in your hand, and just practice the correct angle to weld uphill. Now, you can technically weld vertical up with a straight in angle. This is a straight in angle. It might not look like it because of the camera angle, but this is straight in. You're going to find with 6013 that if you have a straight in angle, the leading edge of your molten puddle is going to oftentimes undercut and underfill. And the longer you take to progress forward, the worse off your molten puddle is going to be because it's going to get so hot, it's going to drip or run or just get flat out too hot and out of control. So having a slight push angle like this is what you want. Now the camera exaggerates how long it actually is. I'll show you. You're actually looking at about like, let me get it to focus here, about like this, okay? So not an extreme push angle. By focusing on a slight push angle, it will help keep that molten metal stuck to the leading edge ahead of your rod rather than undercutting it, especially with 6013. So you want a slight push angle. You're also going to want to, I hate to say it, but cram the rod into the puddle. Now obviously if you cram it too much into the molten puddle, you're going to have the rod stick and you don't want that. But you want to keep some pressure to where you're about as far in as you can get. One of the things you have to understand is, especially with 6013, it has a very bad tendency where the flux on the tip of the rod doesn't melt off fast enough in the internal core. The metal rod inside of this ends up burning back further than the edge of the flux, and it essentially extends your arc gap longer than you think it is. So if you don't keep some pressure on the flux in the molten puddle, it's not going to eat that flux away and keep your arc gap short. And you're going to get a feel for it. Like if you stick the rod a couple times, you want to be just under sticking the rod is the correct arc gap. And once you practice some, you'll get a better idea of that. And you'll see in the video, I'll show like too long of an arc, too short of an arc where it'll obviously stick. We'll go through all that together so you understand more. Now, to get set up, what I would recommend is take your test plate, whatever you got, run a flat bead on plate, just like this, and then we're gonna start learning by welding on that bead. What I find is that vertical up with 6013 without something for the weld, the molten puddle to stick to, it just kind of wants to run and not really do, I guess, do what you want it to. So by having even a little shelf on the side for it to stick to, it will help you get it to be the proper width, height off the plate, etc. It just gives you something to weld to. Welding flat plate like this is the hardest thing to do, and you're gonna find that out as you practice. And you know, this is without a doubt definitely hard. I mean, I can't, you know, I'm not gonna sugarcoat this. Learning to weld uphill vertical with 6013 is gonna be probably the hardest thing in stick you're gonna learn, but just because it's hard doesn't mean it's impossible, okay? So let's, I'm gonna reposition this plate and let's get set up for welding. All right. Got the machine set for 65 amps. We're gonna weld with 332 6013. I already started down here, ran a 1-inch weld, shut it off, realized camera wasn't recording, so we're gonna do that again. I also have an extra light here just to help a little bit. I will be having arc shots, but just so you can see a little bit better right now, I turned on an extra light for you. So we wanna come in here with a push angle on our rod, and we're gonna run about a 2 1/4 inch weld. Now, because of the camera and everything, I would normally like to position my hand over here and then one hand it uphill or some other form of being comfortable. Maybe my elbow on the table and then feed it in. I'm kind of limited here. One of the things you got to remember is when you're welding on something, especially in vertical up, the steadier you are with feeding your stinger in and the rod in, the better off you are. So even like had I been like this, I was just propping the rod on my finger because in this position it made it easier. You got to find something that is comfortable to you. So let me clean this off here and let's look at it. So when you look at that, wake hold on the start, started to run pretty decent about halfway through. Now I don't have hot start enabled on my machine, so the starts are going to be a little bit cold generally. But I would say our amperage needs to come up, simply not enough heat. So we're going to go to 70 amps and then we're going to try it again. Again, we're going to have a slight push angle, and I'm just going to balance this on my finger and then feed it in and run it up. All right, couple things I did wrong. One, I missed the start on it, so I didn't come down far enough, and I also ended up dragging quite a bit over to the side because my finger slipped. So I'm gonna get in a better position, we're gonna restart, and then we're gonna run a couple inches, and we should have a better results this time. Little 1-inch weld, not the best yet. Now, if you noticed, my hand position, I ended up pinching to where I couldn't bring the rod any closer. It's really showing how important hand position is. Now I'm gonna move this out further and reposition the camera for you guys to where I have more access to bring my hands closer. That's starting to look a little bit better. Flowed out pretty decent. A little hot there. That's starting to look a little bit better. Now you can see how humped up it is down in here. Same thing here. A little bit more amperage, a little bit better travel speed, a little bit more consistent because of my hand position. So we went from not so good, a little bit better, to somewhat okay. I'm gonna finish this up, let this plate cool, and then we're gonna run another pass and look at it. All right, so I cooled this plate off in water just to help facilitate practice. You would never wanna quench anything that's actually needs strength, because the quenching will potentially reduce the strength of the weld and it can promote cracking. So our first vertical up, pretty rough. So a lot of things I was doing wrong. My arc gap wasn't consistent, my tie-ins wasn't consistent, my angle of my rod was kind of all over, my travel speed. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna work on trying to be just a little bit more consistent, and I'm gonna run about, we'll say 3-inch long weld. Now, even though I was fairly inconsistent with my travel speed, you can see that overall looks a little bit better than my previous. It's more equal in height, more equal in width. Doesn't look too bad, still room for improvement. One of the things that I wasn't doing on the first bead that I'm now doing is I bring it up slightly, I slightly go to the left, slightly go to the right, and then come up, slightly go to the left, right, up. Some people call it a Christmas tree pattern or upside down T. That does help with 60-13 on stringers. Now, when you just run 60-13 straight in, I find that the metal's almost too liquidy, doesn't have anything to cling to, and just has a tendency to fall down. And then you get very inconsistent height beads. So a slight manipulation in an upside down T seems to really help it flatten out a little bit. And we're talking minuscule amounts. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about. In this, you can see how I progress a little bit uphill, make a little left-right motion, progress uphill a little bit, and keep repeating. When you're welding with 60-13, it's very difficult, at least for me, to run a straight stringer bead and not have the leading edge on the top of the rod get chewed away and deposit too much metal that sinks. A little bit of manipulation like this will generally help you keep the weld from undercutting and from sinking. So as you saw in that arc footage, a lot smoother down here. The second one, even though the weld doesn't look that bad, a slight difference in the arc gap, the travel speed just being inconsistent, it just laid down wider, it necked down here. Overall, not the best. So we're going to do this again and try and get everything right this time and run like a 3-inch weld. We'll watch the arc footage of it and see how it looks, and we're going to just run this all the way up. So I'll do it probably in 3 steps to make sure I get footage of it all. When you watch this footage, I want you to pay attention to the black outline of the rod versus the puddle and kind of listen to it. You can see that I'm moving pretty fast uphill, that the arc gap there appears to be pretty long, and the puddle's really wide because of the arc gap. And it's under control, but it's really not under control, and just listen to it. Now in this one I hold a little bit tighter of an arc, but overall it's still, for the first half, 3/4, still a little bit too long, but it sounds a little bit less crispy than the previous. But listen for when I tighten the arc and you'll actually visibly see it. Another option you have besides the upside down T is to just make a rocking motion back and forth slowly. That will manipulate the puddle enough sometimes to get it to lay a little bit flatter and to overall deposit a decent weld. Now I'm going to do 3-4 passes just on a flat plate uphill. So you can see here it's overall pretty equal in width and height. I'm going to scrub it off a little bit here just to clean it up to run another pass. Now between passes I'm just dunking it in a bucket to cool it off. But you can see 6013 can do a decent uphill bead. It's never going to be as smooth as 7018. Well, we made it to the end. I've been up for quite some time now, so I'm getting pretty tired and I'm going to be calling it a night once I get through this. So what did we learn today? Well, I learned that 60-13 can be run uphill. It's not the best or the greatest. It leaves a pretty rough bead appearance. I mean, I did a little bit more practice after I ran these off camera, and honestly, this is about what I can do with it. The nature of the rod freezes pretty fast, so it's gonna trap whatever, lack of smooth movements you have in it, much like 60-11. And the main thing you wanna shoot for is consistent width, consistent height, and straight lines. So, not bad. How to, just kind of for shits and giggles, I ran a 70-18 2-pass and ran the first, didn't let it cool down, just cleaned the slag off, ran the second, and it runs so much easier and better than 60-13 does uphill. And again, that's not the point of this video. I wanted to stick with a rod that I know will run on anyone's machine in pretty much any circumstance, and 60-13 fits the bill. Since this video is pretty much done, moving forward, I'm not going to be doing much more with 60-13. Like for overhead, I mean, maybe I will, but after that, pretty much we're going to be doing 70-18 and 60-10 exclusively for quite a while. And that's because that's what I personally use for projects, and that's what most people, at least in America, use for most welding projects. It's just with 70-18, it's so much easier to see what you're doing. But yeah, there you have it. Hopefully you learned something. And if you have any questions, comments, just feel free to leave them down in the comment box. Otherwise, until next video, thanks for sticking around.